I am teaching the construction of battle game monsters and scenario monsters separately. You want a couple different basic paradigms, basic principles of design for both those purposes. We'll start with battle game monsters that you just designed to play as the monster class in everyday play. The purpose of the class monster, mechanically, is to provide a specialized feel, roleplay-wise, off of more narrowed mechanics than you normally see in a player class, but more flavorful and interesting for that specific purpose. So, for example, a bow-wielding assassin is able to lurk from a distance and pick off targets and kill while slipping away and recovering and hide again reliably. So if I wanted to make a monster that's similar to it, I need to make sure that it cannot do everything that a bow-wielding assassin can just as well or better. Instead, I pick one aspect of that, which is either the evasiveness or the lethality of that ranged lurker, and enhance it to be superior to assassin in that respect, but weaker in the other one. So if I had, for example, some sort of worm creature that sits and is mostly stationary, but kills very quickly and suddenly from, say, about 20-foot range, it would be perhaps have poison arrow unlimited as its only output of damage, but have absolutely no evasion tools, or be slow. So it would not be able to escape. If it did put itself in a bad position, it would rely heavily on anyone with it to survive. So, that narrowed focus is the main mechanical principle. Once you've got that down and how to limit, but also strengthen the monster at the same time, you can design monsters for any sort of purpose pretty easily. It's a very simple concept. Vulnerabilities are great for that. Whenever I design a monster, I look for vulnerabilities that I can slap on it that will make it feel more like the monster would roleplay, rather than trying to give it just the right amount of power in terms of class abilities. So if I can find a way to flavor a monster up by making it fragile or giving it amorphous, something that works for it physically or encourages a certain kind of roleplay, rather than limiting the overall power I give it, that means I can give it more of the power that makes it feel like a monster. As an example out of these I just created recently, and you want to try to keep unique mechanics to a minimum because they create confusion. Ideally, you want to use abilities that are already established in the Dor Un Avathar or in the core rules to avoid any confusion or misinterpretations of your design. But I made this monster called a Nightshade Scorpion. The concept is that it functions like a scorpion. It's like a tank, but and very lethal, but does not seek out prey very aggressively. It has something called retaliatory, which prevents it from attacking anything that hasn't attacked it or an ally within 10 feet, but it can still take game objectives, like go hold a point, gather items, go pick things up and do stuff. But then if you decide you're going to pick a fight with it, it'll mess you up, like the actual creature would. It helps you. It encourages the player using it to roleplay along the tactics and habits of the creature you're trying to represent in your monster writing. So, with those basic principles in mind, I divide monsters up for my purposes and thought process into several groups based on what exactly they do. Artillery monsters are heavily focused on outputting damage from distance to whether it's gear, players, anything. They output damage from distance without a lot of subtlety involved. Brute monsters function much like barbarians. Actually, that's a good idea. To analog them to player classes, artillery monsters function like archers mostly. Brute, more like barbarian. Not heavily armored, a little bit of toughness to get them into melee and fight for a while where they're comfortable, but not enough that they can be a hard tank. So to compensate for the fact that they're not so durable as a hard tank, they hit harder, often having swing enhancements or abilities that let them drop something quickly and move on to the next target. They're very hyper-aggressive most of the time and go from target to target to target to target to target as quickly as possible. controllers, which function like a battlefield control wizard or a bard that primarily want to control the field for their allies to take advantage of. So rather than inputting direct damage themselves like an artillery monster would, they'll shove away a threat so that they punch a hole for their barbarian or assassin to get in and ruin the team or complete an objective. Maybe buff their ally if they have buffs to just seize tactical advantages rather than destroy things or specifically go take objectives themselves. Lurkers are monsters that are very lethal, like assassins, but require a great deal of team support to function properly, especially because monsters, unlike assassins that have a very healthy balance of evasion and lethality, are going to have generally one or the other. So if you don't, for example with Banshee, cooperate with your team, yes, you have 2 fingers of death, but if all you're doing is looking around to pick off targets by yourself, when you come out of insubstantial, they'll run up on you before you can get the verbal off to kill them. And if you stay too far back trying to be too safe, then your team isn't getting any help out of you. So you have to find a healthy medium working with your allies to compensate for whatever you lack. To kill everything you possibly can. Minions are pot monsters, like goblins, kobolds, any small monster that there are a lot of, usually having sheer numbers, but will die quickly and easily when confronted in a direct fight by your average player. You might have a problem with 5 goblins as one person, but it should never really be a challenge except with exceptionally skilled players as the goblins in a 5-on-5 fight, adventurers versus goblins. That's the basic function behind it. Skirmishers are kind of like brutes in function in that they are very mobile, hit and run. They function more like a scout, but with less utility oftentimes. They're all about harrying, harassing, picking off targets, or if they go in and can't get the target, rather than a brute where they'll just crash through the line and continue trying to kill the target anyway, they'll find that, okay, I hit a wall, I'll just go to a different target. And keep looking for targets and keep harassing, stay at a safe enough distance to survive, usually with less sustain than brutes as a result. So they have a little more overall damage output generally, but less armor and protection, and more sustainability or utility. Soldiers, which are like the hard tank, they function like warriors do. They have very little subtlety to them, and generally either walk in a straight line until stopped, or do not move and prevent you getting to their allies. They are the wall, the brick, however you use them, they are a rigid force that is going to do whatever it wants to do, except for hit as hard as a brute, for the most part. Generally, they should have very little to no ranged options. I highly recommend never giving, not anyway, generally giving soldiers anywhere near as much ranged harassment or damage output as you would give a skirmisher. At the most, I would give heavy thrown or javelins, like a single ranged option, maybe a bow, for those that are particularly flavorfully ranged, like maybe like an elven guardian kind of thing. Some monsters like manticores, if you're trying to make it a hard tank for whatever quest you're designing it for, you might still give it like its trademarked poison spines, but it should also lose some of its durability or other functions to make up for that so it doesn't feel overwhelming. Generally, these are the categories the monsters fall into in general, as I described. Solo monsters that are designed to be taken on their own, but are not scenario monsters in themselves, like mini bosses. Basically, like, think of it this way: if you have scenario monsters are your boss monsters. Mini bosses would be taking a typical Dor Un Avathar monster, battle gameplay monster, and amping it up to be stronger than your average player class, but not really at the level of a boss monster. So, if I were to make just a real quick here, a solo version of this thing I made called the Boulder Beetle. It is a hard tank. It has 5 points of natural ancestral armor. It doesn't move very quickly. It's slow. It has bear strength, so it crashes through things, but very, very slowly. It walks at you and breaks through you and eats you. If I wanted to make a solo version of that, made to deal with a full party of adventurers by itself and still stand a chance of winning, I would make it it's a particularly old or strong beetle that's gotten a lot more powerful as its age. So give it berserk, so combining to give it shield crushing and armor breaking. Maybe give it kick its armor up to 6 or otherwise enhance it, so to make it better at dealing with a group of players. That's something that is important to keep in mind with monster design, is that normally for battle gameplay, it should be able to deal with other players at about the same level as ordinary player class, but when you get into quest design, you need to make sure that they can deal with multiple threats at the same time, presenting a challenge without becoming too powerful for one player to deal with, and also strong enough to be a threat to a full party. Anyway, really, there's not a lot more to designing battle game monsters than that. It all comes down to what you want the monster to do flavor-wise, and what you think it should mechanically be able to accomplish, so that it has that feel. If I wanted to make a little, like a drake, a dragonland creature, I would give it like some armor as like a core thing that would stick with that to me. It's got scaly skin, maybe a swing enhancement, or something to do with like the element of flame or death, or something primal, maybe some dual immunity if it's like a particularly earthy dragon or something. Something elemental maybe, but come up with the core roleplay things first, is my principle. And then after I've come up with the things it really needs to feel like that monster, I then ask, what role is this going to fill? And stat out the rest of it, filling it out for that role along a theme. Because really, if it's not themed out properly, it just feels like a very stale monster, and you begin wondering why you didn't just put somebody there being like a player class with a couple other things thrown on for that purpose.
So what is your balance between like roleplay versus competitiveness when you're designing a monster? Like, should it be much more roleplay heavy than competitive, or because that's where player classes kind of sit, right?
I call it the art to science scale. I believe that in general, especially for battle game monsters, the goal should be 50-50. It should feel fun to play, it should feel fulfilling for the class fantasy of the monster that it is presenting, but it must also, and this is especially important and was heavily emphasized in this edition of the game, the mechanics must be simple and easily comprehensible. Something that was a common problem in the previous edition was that too many unique mechanics were generated for monsters, and it was hard to understand for someone just jumping in with their usual kit to know, what does that thing do? And generally, sticking with easily comprehensible and already similarly precedented abilities is the best way to accomplish that. For example, in the previous edition, we didn't have a way to represent mechanically without making it a unique ability, devouring someone, eating them. So it was its own ability. In V8, Steal Life Essence is the act of draining someone else's power for yourself, which can be roleplay described into you ate that thing. So creatures that previously had Devour, like werewolves, now have Steal Life Essence, EX. So it's not magical, it is you eating them, and you get a heal or a charge the way you would if you were explaining the ability with magic, siphoning their soul for your purposes. And after you've eaten something, all its energy's been drained away, you can't eat it again, which also fits theme-wise into Steal Life Essence working as Devour. You try and justify and be a little creative, see if you can get tricky with it for abilities and figuring out what belongs in there flavor-wise to preserve that consistency and that ease of comprehension. But yeah, in general, you should shoot for 50-50. I would go no more than 60-40 in either direction. Art over science, if it's a little bit lower power than the average similarly mechanical thing, let's say you've got you're trying to make a level 4 soldier monster, it comes out being a little bit more powerful in one tiny aspect because of the roleplay thing you want to provide for it, for the theme, whatever that happens to be. But function range, not sure. Becomes a tiny bit more powerful in one aspect because of the art of it. That's okay, as long as it is generally not overwhelming on the other side of it, which is you applying the science and making sure you don't overbalance the monster in the monster's favor. That's the biggest thing for the convenience of the other people playing the game, you need to keep in mind as a designer is that the monster should not steal any player class's job. It should have its own very specialized job that it does similarly to a player class. Any other questions for that part? Because that's pretty much all I wanted to touch on for battle game design. Okay, cool. On to design for quests and scenarios. The goal is completely different with designing monsters for scenarios and quests. The design of a quest generally has an anticipated end. For example, in a lot of quests, people design it so that the questers are supposed to win. Okay, we all know this. We all compete in quests. And yet, there is still a challenge. There is still an element of, well, if you don't do that right, you're not going to complete the objective well enough. Someone else might beat you to it, depending on how the quest is being run, what the objectives are. It's not impossible to succeed. It's not easy to succeed, but it's still expected that you succeed. There's a balance in the middle. So, you prop up the story using the monsters more as props or as a part of the plot than as individual creatures that are intended to maybe win or lose an individual fight in a purely mechanical sense. So if your overall story has the questers starting at the village they start out in, progressing through the woods, dealing with increasingly difficult monsters, and culminating in fighting the orc leader of the tribe that's been raiding their village, then they need to get to the orc leader or the quest is kind of falls flat. So you need to provide things that will soften them up, require that they feel like they've expended abilities and worked to get to the end goal, but can still definitely do so using those abilities and working together properly. Again, don't be afraid to kill your questers if they're not working together as a team, not actually questing. But you should design so that anticipating and imagining how the fights might play out, people working together and synergizing and coordinating with each other should reasonably be able to defeat each challenge you set them, just at some cost. They should be tailored to the storytelling purpose, and a big chunk of storytelling with coming down to individual monsters and the way that the people who play them for you are expected to act is thinking about how that monster would act, just like from its perspective. So if you have in that scenario I mentioned earlier, where you're trying to get to the orc tribe in the middle of the dark forest, right? And there's a giant spider along the way that is saying the field is open. It's not a bunch of staged encounters, but just you have to get over there and there's stuff in the way. There's a spider in the way. It should be something where it acts like a spider. If it doesn't have prey available, it's not going to seek it out and actively screw with the party for no reason. But if there's food over there, if it sees particular party members as easy targets, it'll go bother and go harass them and try and pick them up. You want it to act like the monster, be very good at acting like the monster to provide the correct feel, but not just feel like it's kind of a forced random encounter. Like, oh, you were wandering through the woods and the half-dragon attacked you. Well, where did the half-dragon come from? Like, as if it's generated on a random table. It should, when you're planning it out deliberately, feel like it's been put there for a reason, and like it has a place in the story, in the environment it's in. Ideally, as a quest designer, you should design your monsters to be easy to understand and RP from the player's perspective, who will be playing the role for you. Because a lot of the time, and this is a volunteer organization, people do tend to volunteer for monster repeatedly if they like it, but you may have people that are not particularly experienced with the mechanics you're asking them to use. You may not have people that are particularly gifted at role playing. There's whatever their capabilities are, they're going to help out, and that's good. But you should make it easy on them to help out. So mechanics that are simple and convey the right tone and flavor very well, but are not overly complex for just rank and file, especially monsters, are a good idea. For example, if I wanted to make a spellcasting monster for flavor purposes for a quest, be one of the rank and file there's a bunch of, I wouldn't give it Magic Caster Wizard 4 and say, hey people, design your own wizard list for this, because I want you to be comfortable with your skill set, because they might not even be comfortable playing wizard or spellcasters in general. So instead, you pick out what flavor kind of magic you want them to use. Like maybe it's an eldritch horror, corrupted thing that there's a bunch of with cultists running around. So you give them madness or fear-based things. Give them like a couple terrors, suppress aura or dimensional rift, things that are give that sorcery and mind control feel. So that there are clear-cut, easy to understand abilities. You provide them the incants and everything in your write-up, and just make it as simple on them as possible, so they just pick it up and can easily see, oh, yes, I'm supposed to make people afraid of me. Hey, you, terror, and just get the quest rolling. It doesn't need to be like a hugely complex masterpiece. It just needs to be a fun quest and convey the right flavor and be easy for both your NPCs and players to understand. As long as the story keeps moving in a quest, it's working. Something I drove myself insane with on a lot of my early quests was over-complexity, over-managing, trying to make sure that everything is running exactly the best it possibly can be all the time, when really, as long as everything's flowing smoothly and there are no issues or confusions you have to go around and correct at the time, just sit back, relax, enjoy the show. If there actually are things you need to correct, go and correct those quickly so that you get the quest rolling smoothly again. But don't overmanage like I did, I recommend. And I also, on that note, highly recommend any quest you run, grieving in it, specifically for the purpose of making sure it runs smoothly. Having other reeves to make sure that, especially particularly challenging things to keep track of, like terrain effects or unique mechanics on a monster, are a very good idea. And grieving is still just something we're supposed to have to clear up rules, confusion and such. So that's all good to plan ahead as well. Additionally, I still say that you should grieve your quests for the specific purpose of making sure they are on track, and people understand the overall quest objective and what they ought to be doing to complete the story. So for the actual mechanical design of scenario monsters, let's talk about that, because really the battle game stuff translates very well into rank and file little dudes for quests. Scenario monsters are expected to deal with multiple people at once. That is a flat-out common thing you're going to have to get used to designing boss monsters for Amtgard. We generally have pretty sizable groups. In areas where we don't have very large groups, we might be able to get away with some more creative boss monster play and like a little more intricacy, because there's fewer people trying to understand this thing at once, and it's easier to get the whole group all on the same page. But if you're designing a boss monster for a kingdom level quest, it needs to be able to fight and like use abilities all quickly and all able to switch, keeping in mind that the person representing this isn't a boss monster, they're a person. From target to target, from function to function, ability to ability, smoothly and again, easily, so you don't interrupt the flow and don't overwhelm your player of the part with too much at once, trying to make them this unstoppable juggernaut. For example, I like to keep these designs especially simple. I have a monster in this book I just wrote called The Darkness That Eats All Things. It is the primeval darkness that stalks the Underdark and eats everything. You run away from it. That is like the whole purpose of it. It is a monster to be feared. It is a boss monster, and the kit it has is that it has a new weapon, amorphous bloodlust, so it has to continually attack all the time, and void touch. That is it. It does not have active abilities, which is not to say that boss monsters cannot have them, but since it didn't need them, I didn't include them. It is an aggressive creature with just has 12 points natural armor. It even has one hit location to make it easy for the person getting hit to keep track of. It has steal, void touch gives you steal life, that's the limit. It has its sustain, so it can continually just eat things. The most complex it ever gets is, I killed you, so I steal life. It doesn't need to do anything more interesting than that, and it just is horrifying all on its own with a very simple kit. Another common trait, something that is generally important, especially in larger quests or quests where there's a lot of magic users, Iron Will is a trait that should be thrown on most boss monsters. It makes them immune to stop, stun, frozen, and insubstantial states. So they cannot just be crowd controlled and dealt with accordingly. If you don't have that, it's a good idea to have at least one or two key schools of magic for crowd control cut off as options. For example, the Darkness That Eats All Things has Void Touched, so even though it doesn't have Iron Will, it's immune to sorcery magic and thus AC Blast and Finger of Death. Two big light shutters right there. But overall, these boss monsters should still fall into the same categories of the monsters for proper flavor. So, along a different route, while most monsters that like dragons that are for quest ends are very tanky, very hard to peel through and chew through, in different scenarios, those aren't even necessarily the best way to design a boss monster. For example, if the overall tone of the quest is desperation and you're trying to complete an objective after like several trials or tests, it may not do best for your quest for you to have the final trial be a giant fight. It could still be, say, another puzzle, yet another task to complete, but the whole time they're being stalked by a lurker, category monster, that is especially dangerous. Something that can hit and run very, very easily and trade reliably with the entire party and then slip back away, crippling them the whole way as they go. Having something that is largely out of reach and is just, let's say you've got especially this is awesome when you've got people that are very highly skilled to work with for your NPCs. Let's say you've got a Paragon Archer who's an excellent sniper. You just put them off at a largely untouchable distance so that people have to either blow extensions to hit it or use a bow or other projectiles and just let it rain death on things. Have an NPC, like a ghost type thing, a spirited thing, run around retrieving its gear for it so it can just keep raining death on the quest. The boss monster doesn't always need to be a final epic confrontation. The major threat can just be a lurking, looming thing that has to be avoided but cannot necessarily be confronted in some climatic way. As long as there is a dramatic conclusion to the quest, it doesn't have to be that you killed the dragon. That's all I'm trying to say with that. Overall, that's really mechanically most of what there is to designing quest monsters. And as people who play the game, I'm sure you all understand that, like, at least some of the base mechanics and the general flow of the game. So when you're asking yourself what you want the monster to be able to do, imagine what goes on at your normal everyday battle game and what players are normally capable of, especially when you're designing a quest level, park level quest, something that with your own community, your own regular group. Knowing your players is a very helpful tool in designing a quest to achieve the result you want, and building your monsters so that they will be beaten if you intend for the quest to be a quest for victory for certain. Knowing your players, you can gear them a little more tightly, make it feel a little bit more tense, a little bit more realistically like a struggle. When you know that eventually, let's say for example, if I were designing a quest now for my own park, I know that if Telly's playing as an NPC here, Princes, then he will stay alive for a long time, most of the time, parry and harass, and will be a general, like, not in huge bursts generally, but he will be constantly outputting lethality into my monster force. So I can account for that as part of the balance and make the story a little livelier because I know that he's going to be continually killing whatever he can get his hands on, or his blades on. And so on and so forth. Vale is another powerhouse at arc holding, and he functions much like a soldier or a brute. He's going to punch through things and get to an objective a lot of the time. If I were designing a scenario where a bunch of cultists are protecting an idol, and I know that Vale is going to be a player, and he's going to be one of the core fighters that helps make the quest roll anyway, I might design the scenario so that it's intended to play out as once the lines of defense are broken through, the heroes punch through, and everyone crashes in and spreads out and wipes out the remaining enemies. Probably with Vale leading, because he's probably just going to be at the front anyway, and then giving, after that initial punch, plenty of other things for the other questers to do, other things for them to dispel, eliminate, use their own abilities on and participate in, so that one person who's a skilled member of the park doesn't outshine the others. You give them their thing to do, and their moment to shine in their category, but then make it so there's still more to do for everyone else, so that everyone is included and everyone gets to feel like they've had an effect on the quest, and it wasn't just, well, we followed around Vale and he killed every fight, like some KLE quests go, because it's more generic writing, because it's 8th KLE. It's something you have to plan for an awful lot of people, and you don't know who's going to be there. At a park level quest, we can get a little bit more intricate and a little bit more specialized to our local community, which is something that I particularly enjoy about writing park level quests. Other than that, it all comes down to the feel you want to evoke, the story you want to tell. That's something that is core about quest design, and I know I've mostly been talking about the design of quests on this section here rather than the design of monsters, but that's because monster design is very simple and functions largely like piecing together a very flavorful player class. And it's generally pretty easy to compare like player classes to monsters in terms of raw power. Like, let's say soldier classes should probably have a little bit less armor than warriors. They're not just equally good as a hard tank. They get other abilities too, but like, don't just out hard tank warrior on the pure hard tank paradigm, I guess. Then again, if it is going to be a pure wall and it does not do any of the other things warrior does that are a little more utility, then it might just be a pure wall. It's got 6 points of natural ancestral armor. What do you want from me? You know, a natural shield, greater heart, and it just stands there. Like, depends on the situation. But yeah, generally it's pretty simple, and if you have a feel for the game and just like looking directly across at the player classes, the mechanics aren't that tricky. It's about making the mechanics express the story and flavor that you want to evoke for the fantasy game you're telling a story in. And that's really the most important part of the quest, the story. And everyone participating in it. Yes? So, what I was trying to say there, and explain it more clearly, is that if you're playing a spider, right? If you think about it, if you're a spider, what you want to do is eat easy targets, right? You don't want to really fight. You want to get your food and go back to your web, right? So, as a hunter spider. So you want to pick off targets that are easy for you to kill. So if you're a spider and you have poison and you see a wizard who is just kind of, to your eyes, you don't really understand magic or anything, he looks like he's wearing, like, nothing on him for the most part. He looks really squishy and pink and soft, and you could probably stab him with your fangs and eat him. And then you see the warrior nearby, elsewhere, and he looks like he's all hard and rigid, and like the fangs might break on him, and like it's just kind of a lot of trouble to go to. Then the thing you normally want to go and kill, if you have the option, is the wizard, right? Rather than the warrior. It's not that you can't go after other targets, it's that when you're playing a monster, you play thinking like the monster. So if the monster wouldn't really want to go after someone else, he'll go after other targets instead, or they'll go after other targets instead. Does that make sense? It's not about being unable to or not allowed to, it's about what's an easier target for predatory creatures. That's also true. Thinking about what level of power you have and what you're good at doing is important as well. So if you're playing a spider that's an abnormally tough spider, it's really armored up, it's really tanky, and it's actually able to fight, then it might go after... Right, then it might go after those beefier targets because they look like food to it too. It looks like an easy target, everything does, because it's just a really strong monster. That makes sense too. It's all in what the monster's able to do. If the monster's able to just like beat up all 5 of those things over there and eat them, of course it's going to. If it's hungry, it's going to go do that, because it can. If it can't, it'll find other targets. But you've got the right idea. The tougher things, the stronger things, to them, increasingly dangerous things still look like easy targets.
It's like a Tyrannosaurus versus a velociraptor.
Right.
Or like a gecko.
Right. Rather than have, well, for the pack hunting, velociraptors or other similar creatures will have to group up and work together to make up for their relative lack of strength and actually use, like, surround their target, go for weak spots. Tyrannosaurus just runs up and bites its prey, and it has it now. Brute force works when you have that much brute force, but if you don't, you compensate in other ways, yes. Correct. Are there any other questions? Because that's really about it. Right.
How would designing a quest monster or a field monster different from designing a player monster?
It's about making it tailored to the purpose of the quest. So if, for example, the tone of the story when the players encounter this monster is supposed to be that you're ramping up for the dramatic finale, it should feel like something that you have, a challenge you have to surmount to get to that really awesome conclusion, but also something that definitely still can be beaten at that stage. So it should feel like, not like a speed bump, but like a ramp to build up to that more impressive thing, while still being impressive itself.
I was more so talking about like PC monsters, because Silvermoon, I guess, is unique that we have like more monsters in just the community.
Yeah.
In the community.
Yes.
How would you design a fancy flavorful thing, but not be stupid on the field?
Oh, like just battle game monsters?
Yeah.
Like, oh yeah.
Yeah, battle game monsters.
Yeah, for those, like I talked about, the main core design tenets you want are to start with what makes the monster mechanically. So like if I'm, like I said, I used an example earlier, if I'm designing a drake, like a little dragonling creature, then what evokes drake, dragonling to me, makes it feel like that in gameplay. Armor is a big chunk, because dragons have famously thick and tough skin. Natural weapons and probably some strength or elemental attunement, right? To give it the feel. Then once I have down what I feel this monster really needs, like let's say 4 points of armor and berserk for the strength and the armor, and we'll go with a more mundane dragon that doesn't have a bunch of magical abilities. It's just really strong and dragonish. Then I ask, what does that need to be specialized into, role-wise, to make it fleshed out as a monster? And if it's depending on what level you want it to be is also relevant. So if I want to make it a level, is it still recording? If I want to make it a level 5, because that's the target I'm designing it for, then it would need to be able to compete with a level 5 similarly mechanical player class. Like if it ends up being like a warrior, but a little bit stronger, then I would make it like it has its 4 points of armor, like I said, which is still 2 below warrior's cap, so that's not an excessive amount of armor. It has berserk, not give it any of warrior's utility like insult or gear or anything to make it much tougher than that, because it's already got its armor and it has more offense than warriors. So leave it with like that swing enhancement, because I don't want it to go too far into the brute function. I won't give it any more offense than that, but maybe give it if it still needs some durability for level 5, it's not going to be magical heavily, so it's not going to have a lot of abilities. I'll give it a couple flavorful things, like Steel Life Essence. It's a big monster, it's going to eat things, it's like a predatory creature. So give it Steel Life Essence a couple times a life to refill its armor back up a little bit, and give it sorry, just had an idea. Already enlisted Berserk, Steel Life Essence. And maybe if I can't think of any other abilities that fit along with that theme, just kick the armor up to Ancestral to give it a pretty big chunk of durability, since I can't think of any other abilities that go along theme-wise. When you can't figure out any more mechanics to throw on, enhance the ones that are already there. Maybe if you have a heavily verbal monster, but you don't want to throw any more verbal abilities on it after a certain point, you've already got all the main flavor points fleshed out, then you give it power level on one or two of the things, so it just swift casts it. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Cool.
And we're gold.
I understand. I'm even getting gold now too.
I couldn't imagine why.
It took long enough. Yeah.